All right, welcome to the podcast. We'll start off where everyone else does. As far as earliest childhood memory, what are we getting into?
You're asking me?
Yeah,
I think here's a really nerdy. This is a really nerd. I mean, listen, I remember like climbing on a cargo net at the playground, but the earliest childhood memory I can like definitively date. I was really obsessed with flags. I had like this big poster
yeah.
in my room where it had a map of the world and all the flags of all the countries. And I guess it was February 1993. Czechoslovakia broke up into Czech Republic and
Yeah.
Slovakia, and I had to like custom revise my flag poster to account for the new flag and the new like the two new countries. So that was February 93. So that's the earliest memory I can like definitively date. But that gives you an idea of what kind of child I was.
I love it. So, lots of questions. Where are you getting these updates from? Is it from the newspaper? Is it a family member? Like how did you even get the update?
In 1990, I was like 3 years old. I'm not sure who told me about the breakup of Czechoslovakia, and I don't know where that information came from, but I very clearly remember like drawing in
Yeah.
the new flag
You
of
just knew that it
Slovakia.
needed to be done.
Yeah, well, I had also I remember like the in my kindergarten, one of the teachers was from South Africa, and I think it was at that point that the flag changed over from the old blue, white, and orange to the modern flag of South Africa because
Yeah.
the new Mandela government was coming in. I guess this is about 1994, and I remember having to update that one as well. So I was very up on all the changes occurring, all the
That's fantastic.
geopolitical.
That's fantastic. Growing up, did you, let's say elementary school, did you play a lot of sports, more academics, just hanging out with friends? What was the vibe?
I am not very athletic. That was actually I got to say that's one advantage of being a firefighter is the gear weighs like 30, 40 pounds just by itself, even without an
Yeah.
air pack or anything. Uh, and so it's a great equalizer. Nobody can tell how unathletic I am when I'm wearing the gear and crawling around. So I really did not play sports when I was a kid.
Okay.
I was like the referee on the soccer field. I always had a good relationship with all the different social cliques. And I was always kind of in the middle there. So I was the ref on the soccer field in elementary school.
Yeah.
In high school and college, actually, I did varsity stage crew for
Okay. Well,
all 4 years.
we'll get into that. Let's hit middle school a little bit. So
Oh, gotcha.
if
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if we don't have a lot of practices going on and things like that, what did you do when you were hanging out with friends, or were we just kind of updating our flags still? What was going on in middle school?
Middle school, I was always kind of a political junkie,
Okay,
and
I love that.
and the irony of this is probably after the 2008 election, I really fell out of it. I
Okay.
really stopped caring as much, and now this is all kind of coming full circle back to those middle school years when I was really into politics. So the of course 9/11 was I was in seventh grade. The invasion of Iraq was I guess it was spring 2003. So I was in eighth
9/11,
grade.
you were in seventh grade. Did you move up? Were you ahead in
I
grades?
was young. I was very young for my grade. So I have an October birthday, and I guess my parents had the option to either push me ahead or keep me back, but they felt I was precocious enough, I guess. I was reading at an early age, so they put me ahead. So I was actually younger than some of the kids that were a grade below me.
Well, I was
That
about to say we're pretty much the same age, and I was in like
yeah,
fourth or fifth grade.
yeah, so I was born in the fall of '89, so
Okay.
I was almost 12 when 9/11 happened. So
Wow.
that was yeah, I was really young for seventh grade. Yeah.
So when that does it make you patriotic? Does it make you interested why it happened and the response? Like, what about it made things more political for you?
It's a great question. You know, I was definitely already interested in geopolitics,
Yeah.
but I probably didn't know a whole lot about Afghanistan before 2001,
Yeah,
just like a lot of Americans. And I was very interested in the debates that were going on as to, well, what what caused this,
right.
who did this, and why. And I was probably around that time that I would say I was a little bit more willing to question the narratives that you heard out of the Bush administration, that they
Yeah.
hate us for our freedoms, and kind of the
Wild concept.
cliche, yeah, the cliche things that you still hear out of the right wing
Yeah.
in the United States. So I think that was a very formative period. Very quickly recognizing after the invasion of Iraq that the evidence that was, that, I remember so vividly, a friend of mine and I were both homesick that week from school, and we were talking on AOL Instant Messenger, going back and forth, watching Colin Powell
Yeah.
at the UN present the evidence of weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to largely be a bunch of lies. So
Well,
I think
I
that
mean,
was,
I think largely is a misstep. I don't think anything they said was true.
yeah, right.
We're giving them a little niceties there.
Right. I'm being very diplomatic in my assessment there. So I think that was very formative for me,
Yeah.
understanding that, hey, even at I was 12, 13 years old at the time, that you really can't trust what our leaders are telling us, that they're willing to lie for their own political ends to achieve certain objectives. And I think that was a that was definitely a very formative moment for me. I also read a book. I was probably a little too young to read this. Sorry, I was probably a little too young to read this book, but there was a book that I read probably early in high school called The Fourth Turning,
Okay.
which is a essentially it's a sociological analysis of American history going back to the very, very beginning in the early colonial days. Um, the two authors published this book in the late 1990s, and it really, it really sounded, even when I read it, it sounded really, really out there and really wild. They identified a recurring pattern of generations that occurred throughout American history. And they identified this recurring pattern where our society convulses and goes through this crisis period. We reform and develop new institutions coming out of the crisis period. There's a great social awakening kind of in the middle of this 80 or 90-year cycle. And then things begin to unravel once again, and we fall into a new crisis period.
Yeah.
And essentially, the concept is that this cycle lasts roughly the length of one long human lifetime. That once all the people who were around for the previous crisis are no longer there,
Yeah.
aren't alive anymore, then the society falls back into a familiar pattern, and we repeat a lot of the same mistakes of the past. And this book, I'm reading this in, the first few years of the current century,
Mhm.
said by the 2020s, America would be deep into a national crisis. And it sounded very crazy
Yeah.
at the time, but I think that was a very influential book for me, especially because the generation that I grew up with as my grandparents, they were the ones that had lived through the
Right.
previous crisis period. My grandparents on my dad's side were Holocaust survivors, and my grandparents on my mom's side, they were born in the US, but of course they lived through the Great Depression
Hmm.
and World War II. My mom's father fought in World War II, all the way through France and Germany.
Wow.
So growing up with that generation, that they were very highly influential on me.
Yes.
And with that book, even though a lot of that generation, they were still around at the time, that was very important for developing my understanding of history. That it's not just this linear progression, that we're not always just marching towards an inevitably better future. That there are a lot of opportunities throughout history where societies do not move forward, where in fact they fall into recurring patterns, and recognizing that we were coming up on another such uh, time period in American history, that was you know, you asked about what I
Yeah.
was doing in middle school. That
So to
I
simplify
guess I
it,
was also like riding my bike and like doing normal things that 12
hey,
year olds
we'll
do.
take
But
that. We'll take that. So to simplify that, it's hard times make hard people, and then hard people make good times, and then good times make soft people, and soft people make hard times. Is that the analogy or the easy form of that?
yeah, I mean that's like really, really boiling
Yes.
it down.
Yes.
I would say the other piece of it is taking into account things like technological change.
Okay.
So just to give an example in American history, the kind of federal government that we developed coming out of the Civil War period.
Yeah.
I'm in Maryland here. I'm pretty close to DC. I was just in the city earlier, going past like the Eisenhower Executive Office building, and which used to be I think they called it the War, State, and Navy Department because
Okay.
those building because those were the departments that were based there. That building was, there are a lot of buildings that were like kind of French Second Empire style. They were built in
Okay.
like the 1870s, 1880s.
Yeah.
These are all the buildings that were built to accommodate the growing federal government that we developed during the Reconstruction era coming out of the Civil War. However, by the 1920s, 1930s, that federal government that we had developed in the 1870s was no longer sufficient to deal with emerging new technologies. We needed to develop all these agencies, all these three-letter agencies that we still know and love in the 1930s, like the FAA to deal with aviation, like the SEC to deal with stock market that was suddenly open to individual investors, the FCC to deal with radio technology. All the state that we had developed coming out of the previous crisis period was no longer sufficient to deal with an industrialized economy where you have large numbers of people working in factories and large numbers of retirees. So we developed the Social Security Administration and all of these other programs. Now we're at the other end of that 80 or 90-year cycle where all these institutions that we developed during the Great Depression and World War II, these agencies and these institutions and that whole federal government that we've grown up with our entire lives, that's no longer sufficient to deal with
Gotcha.
all the new technologies that are coming out. So, right, the SEC is designed to regulate future, commodities markets and futures markets and the stock market. It's not designed to deal with cryptocurrency, right?
Yeah.
It's not designed to deal with
Kelshi?
I was just gonna say call sheet or online betting markets
Yeah.
or Bet360 and like it's just not built for them. And so we're not going to be able to put Humpty Dumpty back together here. I
Right.
think that's a big misunderstanding among a lot of my Democratic candidates running in a district where there are tons of federal workers who work for a lot of these three-letter agencies, or maybe they were recently laid off. We're not going to be able to just put the state back together the way it was, the way that we grew up with. We're going to have to develop new institutions going forward to deal with all these new technologies. So yes, the way you summarized it, boiling it down, I think that's a big piece of it that
Hmm.
the generations that didn't live through the
Yeah.
previous crisis, we're going to have to go through those hard times to relearn a lot of those lessons. But I think the technological aspect of it, I think that's really important to understand what that book
Oh,
and that theory is trying to
absolutely.
communicate.
So when you're either in middle school and high school, when you're developing not necessarily your political view, but how do you see that things get done either at a city level, state level, and then at a federal level? Like, what is your idea of how politics is working at that young age?
Yeah, I grew up in the Philadelphia suburbs, so Philly city government was always
Yeah.
kind of my my frame of reference. I remember in kind of late in high school, they were building the Comcast Center in Philadelphia, which is now I think the second tallest building in
Okay.
the city. Comcast built another skyscraper since then that's even taller, but at the time this was the tallest skyscraper in the city. And I remember the pipe fitters union got into some sort of dispute with Comcast and the general contractor of the building. To save water and to save money, they wanted to put in flushless urinals throughout the skyscraper. But the pipe fitters union didn't like that very much because they wouldn't have to put in all the drains
Yeah.
they wouldn't have to rough in all the plumbing that they normally would for a waterless urinal
Yeah.
system. And so the compromise was they would still let the union have the work to waste all that money putting in the rough in for the plumbing system. It would just, it would just be like in the wall. It just wouldn't be in use. I remember that one like very, very vividly. It was also, I believe it was I apologize if I got this wrong. I believe it was the Iron Workers Union. They were building a new Quaker meeting house in
Okay.
Philadelphia. Of course, uh, Philadelphia, a city founded by Quakers. There are still Quakers in Philadelphia. And they were building a new meeting house, but I guess they didn't go with the union bid for the contract.
Yeah.
And so the union that didn't get the bid went and burned down the construction site for the Quakers meeting house, who
Not
are,
giving
of
unions a
course,
great name on that one.
yeah, exactly. And so, on the other hand, my grandmother was a Philadelphia public school teacher for
Yeah.
20 years. She was a proud union member. So I would say it was an interesting, I had exposure to kind of both ends of this, but I definitely, the lesson I drew from that experience growing up in city, in the Philadelphia area, and of course, hearing and reading and experiencing Philadelphia city politics, I think it was an important lesson about political economy that there are institutions besides the government itself that have their own incentives. There are
Right.
the state itself, unions, different political organizations. They all have their own incentives, and sometimes those incentives don't always align with the interests of the public.
Right.
And that was a really interesting lesson for me. And that's not going to come across as a super left leaning lesson, but
Yeah.
I think to be honest that's a failing that I see among the left in America very frequently, is that we assume that certain institutions and certain forces are always going to work the way that we think they're going to work, and
Right.
we don't always appreciate the way that they're actually going to work in reality, because we don't understand how those incentives line up.
Yeah. Well, it's very tough because so I worked for a union. I was a laborer for 5 years. And I did pipeline work. So I was doing 34
Yeah,
inch pipe. So anything I worked with a crew that got kicked out of I think it was like Indiana or Wisconsin whenever they were kind of shutting down that pipeline. And like I was like, "Hey, where you guys come from?" And they're like, "We just got ran out of town."
yeah,
But it was very interesting. Pay was phenomenal. I believe it was like 42 and a half an hour. And then we would work minimum like 60 to 80 weeks. So paychecks were fantastic. But in Illinois, it's all about who you know. Um,
yeah,
and then somebody I'm making six figures because I know a guy is just like that doesn't necessarily give the union the best name, but the people that were in office kicked out the mob, so it was much better than having the mob in there. So and they were losing millions of dollars because they were smuggling it, they were paying their friends, and then they finally got the laborers like on the up and up, and then the guys that kicked out the mob, they more or less became a little power hungry.
yeah,
So the union, my opinion on it, without rambling too much, is the union was put in place as a reason. It wasn't because people wanted to be greedy, is because they were being exploited. So once you're able to create a system that's going to be beneficial for the workers when they do have grievances and you can bring them up, fantastic. On the other end, my grandpa has owned many a business, and when he was running one that was union, uh, he closed down the business in that part of the city. It was actually in Canada, and then he moved it across town where it could go non-union, and it was a much better financial decision because there's a lot of loopholes, things, stuff like that. So, um, it can be really good, and then it can also have some headaches, but ultimately. if you can combine productivity and more or less not screwing over your workers, I feel like we can work together.
Absolutely.
But yeah, when it comes to like the Chicago Teachers Union, I have a lot of friends that are teachers and they've been in that union and they're like I mean, they're not here for us. Like it's more about monetary value rather than the actual education, and that's why a lot of the teachers are there, but the money's just go it's gone. It's gone. It's gone.
That's a good example of kind of where these incentives can really lead down, I would say, a dark road
Yeah.
where the incentives of that union and the incentives of the students themselves, maybe that doesn't always overlap
Mhm.
100%. And it's just it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be paying teachers
Right.
well or treating them well, but we just need to understand and appreciate uh, institutions like unions, institutions like different government entities, they have their own incentives and they're going to behave that way in a political environment. And that's just something to take into account.
It's very interesting though. A lot of the unions, the people that I worked, vote Republican, and all the union leaders are like, "Hey, if you guys want jobs, especially in Illinois, you need to vote Democrat." And they're all, and I'm just like, "You guys,
This is I hear a lot of stuff about a lot of, we America doesn't have a really well-defined hard left the way a lot of European countries do.
yeah,
But I kind of hear a lot of people on the left, especially in the last few years, kind of cosplaying a hard left the way they do in certain other countries.
yeah,
And we hear a lot of language about work things like solidarity with workers and the working class and class warfare. This sort of like very, very left-coded language. My own experience so I'm a volunteer
yep,
firefighter, but both the departments I've served with are combination fire departments, meaning that we
okay,
have both volunteer and career firefighters. Um, I noticed that I guess in the 2020 election, I remember the national IAFF pretty early on in the cycle issued an endorsement of Joe Biden.
hmm
And then all the locals, all the union locals, especially in the Northeast, like Philly and New York, like basically these are the only city departments that have through uh, in large part because of the way the unions work there,
right,
they've remained majority white in cities that are otherwise majority minority. All the union locals, where the majority of the firefighters are still white, issued their own endorsements of Trump. The locals issued their own endorsements of Trump, and so it's so that's kind of that's been my personal experience and
yeah,
my own perspective. Where you're absolutely right, um, a lot of the union leadership, they understand how where their bread is buttered,
right,
and like you say, hey, if you guys want jobs, we need we need Democrats in office. But the rank and file of a lot of these unions, they are very hardcore MAGA. And I will say that was a big incentive for me to get involved in politics myself.
yeah,
Was during that was kind of the first big flashing red warning sign for me in the 2016 election. Was I remember sitting around the table, I was still in Pennsylvania at the time, and we were sitting around the table at the firehouse, and the cops come in and eat lunch, and we're there eating lunch, and of course Fox News is on TV 24 hours a day.
oh
And I remember
no,
that, and this has been Fox News is still on 24 hours a day. It's been there playing there for 20 years, and I imagine it's much the same in a lot of firehouses.
yeah,
And maybe that's part of how we ended up in this situation. But um, I remember this is back when Fox News was not totally, Trump state media the way
yeah,
it is today. They still had, you still had the Mitt Romney wing of the Republican Party was still very much dominant,
yeah,
even on Fox News during the 2016 cycle. And so this was during the 2016 Republican primary.
okay,
And I remember they had a commentator on TV, and she was a female Republican commentator, and she was saying, look at Melania Trump. Is this who you want as the first lady? Is this who we want representing the United States? And unanimously around the table, well, maybe except for the one gay cop, but all the other cops were like, yeah, this is who we want representing our team. She looks great. That's who we want representing our country.
Yeah.
We don't want Hillary Clinton, who reminds us of our wives at home who yell at us for not doing basic household chores. And that was really that was kind of early in 2016, and
Yeah.
I recognized that there was a serious problem with the way Democrats are communicating to some of these guys. And sure enough, Pennsylvania went Republican. And I'm not saying that the solution there is uh, to try to match their misogyny
Yeah.
and ignorance. But clearly, look, politics is about getting enough people on your side.
Right.
And in the last 10 years now, I don't think the Democratic Party has really done a much better job of communicating with these voters who we do need to win, and who in many cases we can win back. A lot of these um, union guys are winnable votes for us. We just have not really done a very good job of communicating or messaging or putting forward a platform that very clearly shows, hey, here's how we're going to make your life better.
Yeah.
And in the absence of that, a lot of politics just devolves down to red team versus blue team vibes. And I think that's ultimately what a lot of people vote on. That's the main lesson I've drawn in however many months on the campaign trail, is that policy is for nerds and vibes are for voters. That most people end up making voting decisions based on what I would consider trifling or spurious factors.
Yeah.
But that's how our system works,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I can't change that. Like I told you before, we've done all sorts of videos. We've had a very aggressive social media program doing
Right.
all sorts of videos on different issues, from housing to healthcare policy to, we went and filmed at a hospital and filmed,
Yeah.
at different places all around the district, trying to explain how I would promote certain policies. And the only thing that anybody ever wanted to watch out of all those videos was our stupid brain rot train video. And a million people have watched that in the last week.
It's
So
not it's not stupid if it gets people to your page.
you're absolutely right. And that's a hard lesson for a policy nerd like me to recognize, but that you're 100% right. That is
So
uh
so as far as being a policy nerd, had you ever through your time period in politics from like high school to college and whatnot, did you ever not necessarily change parties, but ever think like, hey, like there's a lot of policy talk. There's a lot of these things being said. There's a lot of breadcrumbs being handed my way, but in reality, like we both suck.
I was abs so I did change parties.
Okay.
In high school, I would say I was a kind of a moderate Republican, maybe more of a libertarian.
And what pushed you, like what were your views at that point to summarized ish?
Sure. So my philosophical background is very much is very classical liberal. I would
Okay.
say John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith, both civil and economic libertarianism, recognizing that in general the most prosperous countries in the world also have uh, civil liberties. They also have free markets, and it's not a coincidence that's the case. And so, that was, I would say, more. I was more ideological at the time.
Yeah.
My experience of being in the fire department and seeing firsthand how a lot of people struggle to get by,
Hmm.
especially seeing like really tragic cases of through EMS responses of people who fall through the cracks in our society. I think you go to pretty much any fire or EMS department, especially those in relatively urban areas. 80% of our customers come from 20% of the population. You see the same people over and over again. People who don't have access to regular medical care, who can't afford to stay on their prescription medication, people who end up allowing relatively manageable medical conditions to devolve into more serious emergencies. And then that's when they call 911. That's when they get a ride to the hospital and they end up relying on the emergency room as their primary care. And without sufficient follow-up care, without being able to access care on a regular basis, they just end up right back in the same place or in a much more serious condition a few days or a few weeks later. And I
Yeah.
think you could talk to any firefighter or paramedic in an urban area, and they're going to have that experience. So not only I'm a first responder in my own community
Yeah.
in Maryland, but my real job is I'm a grant writer and a consultant for fire and EMS departments all over the country.
Okay.
So I recognize that the things that I see in my own community, the things that are happening here, these same sort of patterns are being repeated in pretty much every community all over the country. And look, as first responders, it's not our job. Our job is to respond and deal with the emergency
Right.
and hopefully go home safely at the end of the day. We don't usually get involved in the policy behind it. But I have to say, it takes a lot of cognitive dissonance. It's very disappointing to see a lot of my fellow firefighters who will go out on these calls and they're seeing the same
Yeah.
things that I'm seeing. They're seeing the same people who fall through the cracks, the same people who can't access basic medical care. And then we'll get back to the station. They'll literally and figuratively wash their hands of it and go right back in the kitchen, put Fox News back on the TV and complain about people who are getting welfare or Medicaid
Yeah.
or Medicare as somehow being leeches on the system when it should be very apparent from what we're seeing every single day that some sort of universal healthcare system would actually be much more efficient. So we're not dealing with these situations that we're dealing with day in and day out. So I think that's really what caused a big change in my politics, recognizing that yes, it didn't turn me into a socialist. I think I agree with a lot of socialists on a lot of policy issues, but at the end of the day, I'm still the same classical liberal. I recognize I want our economy to generate wealth. I don't have a zero sum conception of what wealth is.
Yeah.
I want our economy to be a great generator of wealth and prosperity, but I also recognize that we need to set aside a relatively small portion of that wealth to take care of a relatively small portion of the population, and that would improve outcomes for everybody across the board. That would improve our society as a whole. I'd also say that I started dating an Australian in
Okay.
2016, who I'm now married to, and I started going back and forth to Australia, doing a very long distance relationship,
Yeah.
and seeing how their healthcare system, which is seeing how their healthcare system works. Their healthcare system is also called Medicare.
Yeah.
They implemented it at around the same time that we were implementing a lot of our Great Society programs. And it's a very interesting case study in two very similar countries that diverged around the same time and went down very different paths with our two healthcare systems. Um, their Medicare essentially functions as what we would maybe call a public option, a
Yeah.
strong public option where everyone is automatically enrolled into Medicare. You simply go to a point of service, do what you need to do, and the the federal program gets billed. If you want private health insurance, you can do that. You can still buy private health insurance. You can still get care outside of the public system. So it's not a single payer system in the same way that the NHS is in the UK or the way Canada works, which is
Yeah.
usually the foil to our healthcare system that I hear about from people in comment sections online. But I thought it was a system that works really well. It's a
Yeah.
system that's common in a lot of OECD countries, basically every other OECD
Yeah.
country. And I think it's an easy model to adopt here. So I would say the combination of being in the fire department, seeing people who are really struggling, and then also seeing how another developed Western country works with a much better system, that did change my politics to a large extent. The joke in Australia is that the Democratic Party in Australia would be the right wing party,
Yes.
that the Democratic Party that we have in the United States is so much more centrist than most, even what we would call center left parties in
Right.
other Western countries. That's the joke, is that the Democratic Party in the US is the equivalent of the liberals, who are the center right party in
Right.
Australia.
So, but I should have wrote these down, but I feel like I got three topics here.
Yeah.
I started and have always been more in like the fitness and health space. And to me, for a long time, I was like, okay, like I figured out ish like my health journey, how to be healthy, so on and so forth. And when somebody had just gotten to theirs and then they would get on social media, it's like, oh, I did this one thing, I did these three things, whatever it is, they would be thoroughly confused when somebody else just didn't do the same thing they did and get to the same thing. Or I would start working with clients, and that was the hardest thing. It's like I had a bunch of tools, but the path that they were on, or whatever I was able to get them, it just didn't get them there. So for me, it took a long time to understand, to put it simply, is they are who I am, just in a different life. Like I would be doing nothing different if I was in their life. So when I see the firefighters or my friends that are voting a particular way, I was like, your life has led you to 100% that decision. Like I talk to or respond to a lot of Democrats that are like, oh, MAGA, they're a bunch of idiots, or they always vote this way. I'm like, you would do the exact same thing in their life. So my main goal is to be able to have a conversation, a nuanced conversation about all the topics, how we got there, so that we can figure out what the best solution is. Because, like you said, vibes, like a lot of vibes. We're not able to have those conversations. But then when it gets to the healthcare portion, in my understanding of it is we spend an astronomical amount on it anyways. We're paying for the homeless people or whoever to go to the emergency room, so our premiums go up. If you want to be fiscally conservative, universal health care, and then it's going to be cheaper, and then people are going to be living more.
Yeah,
And
we have this weird Calvinist thing in America where that's the worst nightmare for a lot of people, and I think there's a lot of racist. Um, there's a lot of coded racist language with the way people talk about these programs. That seems to be the worst fear of a lot of people in American politics, is that a black person would benefit from some sort of program and get something that they don't deserve. And
so
I think especially Republican politicians are
yeah.
very good at manipulating that sort of fear and using this sort of coded language as a dog whistle. Unfortunately, it's a very highly effective political technique in America.
So um would you say that uh how do I not say racists are good? Um
Yeah.
so I had a gentleman on here. He was on Rogan and he was the head of the a KKK chapter that was rather large. And he just didn't have the life experiences of actually meeting a black person or meeting an Indian person and understanding that they are real people. Like the city that I grew up in, Batavia, we had three black families. Like I had no understanding. There was also no negativity around it, but also there just was the lack of life knowledge around those situations. So and like my grandma grew up very wealthy, silver spoon in her mouth, did like from just unbelievable lucky. And then like if there was a black person that married into the family, there may not have been nice things said. But that that was her life. And at 90, like if you go to talk to her about it, it's like, what do you like? Leave me alone. Like this is where we're at. So when I'm talking to somebody that I think the best way is like they're afraid of a race, and it's more of just afraid of the unknown. Just I think it's easy to point out, where it's really easy to point out like, hey, there's a fat person, I'm gonna show the flaw that they have. But like there's a lot of healthy people that could be awful with financials. So I think the not necessarily the racist card or the coding is just a it divides a lot of people because if we go the right is mostly racist or that like I agree that they're playing to a fear, but I think in general they're just that's just kind of where they are. Um, and I try I'm not gonna say I necessarily try to please everybody, but I at least want to have everybody at the table.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
My concern in U.S. politics is that in many ways we're devolving back to an earlier era where we're being openly racist towards certain groups
Okay.
is suddenly becoming more acceptable rather than less acceptable. That there's
I'll give you that.
especially among younger people, especially in an age of social media where saying the most outrageous thing gets you the most views, gets you the most attention.
Okay.
I think we were talking earlier about incentives, and I think there's a huge incentive for people, especially those in politics, to say the most outlandish, outrageous thing uh, in order in that's how you succeed in the attention economy, and that incentivizes of course it incentivizes a lot of performative racism for
Yeah.
shock value. Uh, but I think there genuinely has been an explosion in the last few years of anti-Semitism online. You can go into any comment section on just about any issue, and it usually devolves b back to it's hard to see any comment section these days without some sort of anti-Semitic remarks. You mentioned your KKK guest
Yeah.
and Indian people. I think that's very common these days. And my concern is that people are following the incentives of the attention economy, and that we're undoing a lot of the social progress that we made that made attitudes like this unacceptable in politics. Just look at someone like Dan Blazarian or James Fishback and how they haven't completely succeeded yet, but they are running relatively uh, popular political campaigns right now, largely on a platform of open racism, and that's my concern about where a lot of this leads. That if
Yeah.
my family is Jewish, and as I mentioned earlier, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. I think a lot of what you see in history is anti-Semitism pops up in very sick societies where let's be honest, especially the right wing politics in America, right wing politicians don't really have a solution to a lot of the ills that they want to fix. They don't have a way to bring back manufacturing jobs. They don't have a way to actually reset our society back to this idealized past glorified era of the 1950s or the 1850s or whatever they have in mind for this past society that they want to take us back to. And so it's very easy to assign blame to a particular group, and you see this. I think we think as Americans that we're kind of immune to this to some extent. That we're a unique story. We're a melting pot. We
Yeah.
don't have this sort of medieval peasant sort of racism that they have in other countries. But the truth is, this is a very similar national origin story in a lot of different countries. But one of my favorite historians, Timothy Snyder, who used to be at Yale, he's a great scholar on Eastern Europe. He was at Yale. I believe he's in Toronto now. He's actually left the country because of the current political environment. Uh, but he's pointed this out a couple times where the story always goes, once upon a time, our country was pure and strong and everything was great, and then something came along and ruined it. The I mean, it's usually the Jews, but somebody invaded, somebody took power, somebody subverted our economy, someone took our resources, and uh, now we're going to make insert country here
Yeah.
great again. And I think this is something that's very integral to especially the fascist movements that have arisen since the early 20th century. the Nazi movement was in large part a make Germany great again movement, right? The German Empire was strong and powerful. Then the Jews stabbed us in the back. We lost World War I. We're going to take revenge and we're going to make Germany great again. Mussolini's fascist movement in Italy was very much the same thing. They weren't uh, they were going back to a much more distant point in history. But you go all around Italy today and see a lot of buildings that were built in the 1930s that look very intentionally like modernized Roman temples that they were trying to evoke the glory era of the Roman Empire and in many cases actually physically restore the borders of the old Roman
Yeah.
Empire by joining in wars of conquest all around the Mediterranean. And I think you see the same thing in the MAGA movement today that, once upon a time, our country was great. And then all these immigrants came in and ruined it. You hear a lot about the immigration law changes of 1965. I hear a lot about that in right-wing spaces. And now we need mass deportations and we're going to, make our country we're going to make America great again by expelling all these people that have polluted our society. And I think it's very important to recognize this same train of thought and these very similar this very similar sort of politics that you see as a common thread throughout these different movements.
Yeah. So I like, and this is what ultimately I'd like to have like a specific segment on. We're going to talk about this point, and then let's break it down. And I don't know if it was Einstein, but I like to say it. If you can't describe it easily, then you don't understand the topic enough. I tend to go a little bit too easy, and then I miss out on some minutia or very important things. So I'm going to say kind of my main idea on that specific topic, and then we can more or less you let me know where I'm wrong or the
Yeah,
opinion
yeah.
could be different. So
Give it a try.
the as far as the MAGA Make America Great Again, the 1950s and 60s, 70s, whatnot, um, taxes were super high. Like we had the top income tax of 91% after your first 2.3 million in today's dollars. It was an effective tax rate of 45% because there were still loopholes, so on and so forth. And that high income tax would incentivize the company to either improve through research and development, actually expanding the business, or paying your workers more. And that's why our economy, in my mind, was so big, is because the middle class was getting compensated well, and it was incredible because then they go out and stimulate the economy. They're the best at it. Instead of like government programs where it has to go through different channels, you just feed the money to the American people, and they're gonna spend it where they need to. And another part that I have a hard time with the people on the right, if we're looking at free market capitalism, we don't have any large corporations. We don't have these monopolies, and there's enough competition to actually either keep the prices low or pay the workers enough to bring them in. So if you're Milton Friedman, I like a lot of his stuff, and he says if with as far as like negative income tax, I'm just going on 20 different things here, but if the economy is not doing well enough for the average American, then something's wrong. So he said it wasn't perfect, but a negative income tax. If you're not making, we'll say the minimum of $50,000 a year and you made 40 this year, we're going to send you to 10 grand because we have created such a great economy that everybody should be doing well, but this economy has failed you. So we're just going to directly give you the money. And I think that's what a lot of people forget is if the economy isn't thriving like it should to be, then there either needs to be a quick fix or a closer look of why it's not working. Um, but I'd say the arguments are why really was the economy doing so well in the 50s through the 70s? Was it the pay raises and stuff like that? Like what would be the corrections or different opinions you have on that?
Yeah, so a lot to break down there, but I want to go back to your very first
Yeah,
point. I think you've made this on your social media a number of times. And I think it's a really
I'm
important
I'm
point is that
trying someone to tell me I'm wrong. I'm
No, no, I think this is, I think you're dead on here. I think a lot of people misinterpret this. That I notice a lot of people on the left also cite the 91% top marginal tax bracket
Yeah.
back in the 1950s as an example of socialist redistributive economics, and that's not actually the case because,
Thank
as you
you.
pointed out, the point of that was that the was the point of that very high marginal tax rate was to get companies to end up with a lower net income
Yeah.
by paying their workers more, by investing in research and development, that if by buying capital equipment. That was the whole point of that very high marginal tax rate. It wasn't to maximize revenue for the government so they could redistribute it. And I think that's a point that's very, very misunderstood. And maybe, if you haven't run a business before, it's a little hard to wrap your mind around it, or
Yeah.
if you don't have some sort of finance or economics uh, background or education. But I think that's a really, really important point. We should also point out that look, on the one hand, the economy back in the 1970s was not perfect,
Right.
but by any means. In It's very easy to memory hole something like stagflation, which you and I never lived with.
Yeah.
Um, it's I was my my grandma passed away a couple years ago. We were cleaning out her house, and I came across, like, an old mortgage statement that they bought their house in 1980, and I think they just uh, you know I think they had a mortgage for like a very brief period of time, and then they paid it off. But it was something like a 16.5% mortgage.
Yeah.
Inflation was extremely high. Unemployment was extremely high. There was also there were fuel shortages. The economy was really not functioning that well. And I think it's easy to idealize uh, the things that we like about these previous eras, and you see this on both sides. That
Absolutely.
the right wing idealizes a period like the 1950s because our society was a lot whiter than it was back then. They like this. They like the idea of racial purity and racial hierarchy more than they actually want to go back and live in the 1950s. And you see this all over. If you look at the official DHS Twitter account, or X, whatever the hell we're calling it these
Yeah.
days, you see Donald Trump himself has reposted a lot of AI generated content where they harken back to, they'll post something like an AI generated photo, or maybe a real photo of a well-dressed family with a car in the 1950s, and they'll say something like, this is what they took from you. This is what they made this illegal. Nobody made that illegal. A relatively small percentage of the population had access to material
Okay.
wealth like that. I think there was a uh, it the economy was certainly different back then, but I think what a lot of people on the right are idealizing or fetishizing about that era is really more of a racial
So
fantasy. And
what
I
was,
would also say
yeah.
on the left, the left does the same thing in economic terms, that we talk about. Oh, well, back in the 1950s and 60s, you could support a family on a single income. That wealth was much more broadly distributed, but there was still very grinding poverty in the 1950s and 60s that a lot of our Great Society programs started to help with. But we shouldn't have any real illusions about what the economy looked like back then. It's absolutely true that wealth was more evenly distributed
Yeah.
back then, and that a lot of the gains in our economy, especially in the last 15 years, really since the global financial crisis, most of those economic gains have benefited a relatively small portion of our society. But the GDP of the entire United States economy is many, many times what it was 50 years ago. And so, I think the key is to develop policy that allows for broad-based economic benefits, for broad-based gains in wealth, while not removing what makes our economy dynamic. And it's a tough balance, but I don't think that we should constantly look back to the 1950s and 60s and say, oh, well, they had it all figured out. I think there are certain lessons that we can take from that
Yeah.
era and apply to our uh, apply today. But as we discussed earlier in the show, uh, part of the reason that we're in this situation is because institutions like our tax system have not caught up with technology. As you've pointed out in some of your other podcasts and on your social media, a lot of the wealth that's been generated in the last few decades is going to holders of assets. That if you're just drawing a regular paycheck on a W-2, it's very hard to keep up with increased expenses. That really the economic benefits of especially the last 15 years, have gone to holders of real estate and financial assets.
Mhm. So, how do you, because I think that you made a good point. It's not that we need the exact same things that we had that back then as far as policy, but the lessons are we can see what happened and why. And when I look at policy, I would prefer there to be, hey, here is the goal, and this is the guardrail that we set up, or this is how we do the goal, and this is more or less how we're going to measure it. I think that another thing that I say a lot is I would like there to be less welfare programs because the economy is doing so well. Um, but then the economy is not doing well either, but you want to cut the program. So it's it's if you do those things, you have to be like, okay, here is the expectation. Okay, did we meet? Did the thing I say happen? No? Okay, then let's change. How are you able to have those discussions with people and them not run out of the room or start yelling at you?
Yeah, I one thing I really like about you is that the way you talk about taxes
Yeah,
uh, is that you talk about the incentives. That's
correct.
really how we have to think about tax policy. Is that if you're increasing taxes on something, you're disincentivizing it, and if
Mhm.
you're giving a tax break for something else, you're incentivizing it. And going back to your real or imagined Albert Einstein quote, that is how a lot of tax policy boils down. And so we should be taxing things that we don't want to happen,
Yeah,
and we shouldn't be taxing things that we do want to happen. And I think that's a uh, that's been a huge policy failure of Congress in particular, is that our tax policy is still designed for an industrial era where you had millions of people working in factories paying payroll tax, and compared to the size of our economy today, much more economic activity and much more wealth is being generated simply through asset inflation, which
right.
was not the case 70 years ago. Um, I would like to see the US move towards a tax system much more similar to what they have in other developed Western countries. Again, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. A lot of these problems that feel intractable in
Yeah.
our society, these problems have been figured out in other OECD countries. The things like a universal healthcare system. It sounds like such a pie in the sky idea to a lot of Americans, but the fact of the matter is the other 30 something OECD countries all have universal healthcare systems. They've all figured this out.
Well,
It's
I feel like in a way we do have a universal health care system, just not everybody pays for it and we pay more. Just
I
because
don't
everyone's getting health care, but not it
Everyone's getting, yeah,
yeah,
look, if you want to get really technical about it, sure. If someone doesn't have health care coverage, they don't have any sort of health insurance, they never go see a doctor until they're on death's door, and then they call 911, and I show up with a fire truck and an ambulance, and we take them to the hospital, and they get put in a trauma bay, and then they go to the operating room, and then they get discharged, and they go back right to where they were a few weeks prior. Yeah, technically everyone can legally get care on an emergency basis like that. But I don't think we should have any illusions that somehow that's a universal healthcare system. That's not what universal healthcare coverage means, right?
No, totally. So I would say the um better example would be we're already paying for everyone to get more or less emergency care. We're paying for more expensive things. We might as well have a better system set up because we're ultimately paying for it.
It's a great way to put it, is that we're ultimately paying for it. And it would be a lot easier to give people access to preventative care
Yes.
and make sure people can afford to stay on their prescription medications so they don't end up in the emergency room for a relatively manageable medical condition. We we talk about health. We talk about health, something like healthcare or universal healthcare, as if, oh well, there's no way we could afford that. We already spend the
Right.
most per capita of any country in the world on healthcare. So the idea that we can't afford it when we very obviously can't afford our current system, it's just lunacy. But to go back to tax
Yeah.
policy in particular, and I think this is probably something I disagree with a lot of people on the left on. I don't see tax policy necessarily as this populist means of seizing back wealth
Right.
from a small percentage of people that are hoarding it. That's not really how I'm looking at tax policy in populist terms like that. I do think that we need to ensure that people on the very high end of the income spectrum are not paying less as an effective tax rate than a nurse or a firefighter. I think that's totally fair to say. And to your point about that 91% top marginal tax rate in the 1950s, the overall effective tax rate for those very high income earners was still 40 something percent.
Yeah.
That it wasn't a 91%. It's a marginal tax rate that it's
Right.
only income over, I believe you said, if you
2.3.
adjusted
Yeah.
for inflation, $2.3 million, right? I think those are very reasonable targets. If you actually look at our income tax brackets, the US already has a very progressive system, but there are so many loopholes that it's very easy for net income earners to avoid paying a high effective tax rate. So I would like to see some sort of minimum tax rate on very high income people. I'd also like to see the cap on Social Security tax go away. That cap, it adjusts
Why?
right, that it doesn't make any sense that, I'm only paying Social Security tax on the first 180, I think it's $186,400
Yeah.
of my income. Sorry, I'm off by a couple $100. It adjusts every year, but roughly, I'm only paying Social Security tax on my income up to that amount. If someone's making $1 billion, they're not paying their fair share into that system, and it's only going to be a few years from now where Social Security is essentially
I think that's
bankrupt. And
2030.
yeah, it's really not that far off. So I think those are two really basic reforms that we can implement. I would also like to see some sort of national value added tax, the way that they have, again, in pretty much every other OECD country. At the same time, recognize that is a impact on cost of living for a lot of people. I would like to see a commensurate reduction in something like income tax or payroll tax for working people. And again, this is where I probably disagree with a lot of people on the left. I don't think we need to we can do a lot of these tax reforms and keep the federal government revenue neutral. I think in general we have a spending problem. We don't have a revenue problem. We
Right.
need to be spending on much very different things, but it's obviously not sustainable to keep spending $7 trillion a year and only taking in $5 trillion. So we have to pick one
Yeah.
or the other. Again, a lot of these reforms we can do maintaining revenue, that this can be a revenue neutral exercise. It
Right.
can be implemented over the course of several years to allow capital markets, real estate markets to adjust and make investment plans accordingly. It should there do need to be pretty radical tax reforms, but we can do it in a way that doesn't cause a serious shock to the economy. But at the same time, we don't necessarily need to extract an additional $2 trillion out of the economy. We can rebalance to match this new tax structure.
So I like my opinion on it is ultimately we need to fix the middle class America. Everything is becoming less affordable. So either there needs to be a tax structure where they're allowed to hold on to more of their money and or the price of things gets cheaper. I don't see the price of anything getting cheaper. So I actually saw a really interesting comment and I want to see how people would get around it. But as you turn either 18 or whenever you get into the workforce, your first $1 million or whatever the number is, $2 million tax free. So that's giving the incentive to grow a business. That's in creating free market as far as low barrier of entry for whatever it is for either you'll be able to stimulate the economy if you're a W-2 worker because you're gonna keep that money, you're gonna spend that money. But if you are lucky enough to be able to hit that $2 million when you're 20 because you had the business, or when you're 30 or 40 because you've just been working a W-2 job, I feel like that's a much better way to keep the money in the workers' hands, which is ultimately the issue that we're trying to deal with.
I, I think it's actually a fabulous idea. I've heard that one
Yeah,
batted around a couple times. I would say the larger issue here is that our tax structure, but also a lot of other aspects of federal policy are geared towards an older crowd rather than a younger crowd. You know, I I've seen everything on yeah, I mean there are serious proposals in Florida right now to eliminate property taxes for seniors
yeah,
that a lot of things in our society are geared towards uh, senior citizens and not towards helping young people start a family or buy a house
yeah,
or have a path forward in life. And I think that's really key to understanding the recent surge in popularity of right-wing populism, that when it feels like there is no clear path forward economically for a lot of people,
yeah,
again, we're not the first society to experience this. That's a huge driver of fascist movements throughout history, and
yeah,
I don't, you know, I don't think we're any exception here. And you actually see that a lot in the U.S., where especially young men who feel like that they don't have a clear path forward in life or a way to buy a house or start a family, they naturally gravitate towards uh, right-wing politics, which promises easy solutions to complicated problems that
yeah.
we're going to, you know, kick out the immigrants, and that's going to free up a bunch of houses. This is this that's I'm not saying anything that hasn't already been said by official uh, federal officials, the DHS account
Yeah.
on Twitter. That this is the official policy of the United States, is that we're going to, you know, mass deport enough people. It's going to free up a bunch
Well,
of houses. I mean,
I,
it.
I'm pretty sure Trump walked that back pretty quickly after a lot of his donors let him know, hey, we like the cheap labor.
Of course, and
But
this is, yeah, and
yeah,
that's always the tension in the Republican Party. That's why Congress has pushed off the, you know, any sort of substantive immigration reform
yeah.
for 40 plus years.
But I,
But the larger, getting back to what we were talking about with tax policy, the larger point is that we don't make it easy for people who are just starting out in life to get a foothold, especially in the new economy. So yeah, I love the idea of that tax policy where, you know, the first X amount of your income is totally free of federal taxes. I would also say a big part of my campaign in my primary has been talking about housing policy.
okay.
You're right. Not, it doesn't feel like anything is getting cheaper here. And just you brought Milton Friedman into the conversation. And admittedly, I'm a big fan of Milton Friedman. I think he was one of the most effective communicators when it came to the ideas and the philosophy behind free markets. And one of his hallmark, I don't want to say policies, but something that he would often espouse in talking about monetary policy is that inflation is necessarily a function of how much money the central bank is printing. And it's only natural that in an era where we're running enormous federal deficits, where in order to sustain that, we are necessarily pumping trillions of dollars into the economy and new dollars every year. I think this is something that a lot of people just really don't understand how any of this works. Something like I believe it's more than 40% of all the dollars that have ever been created, all the US dollars that have ever been created have been created since COVID started in 2020. And so it's only natural that that money doesn't get evenly distributed throughout the economy, right? It necessarily ends up going into certain sectors of the economy before others. And so that is a huge factor that's leading to inflation of certain classes of assets. That's what's fueling something like Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, that you have all this hot money in the economy that's looking for a rate of return in an era of artificially suppressed
Hey,
interest.
Bitcoin's getting hammered right now because it's not the bet.
Correct. I mean, let's
Yes,
zoom out over the last, 15
correct.
years. Yes, I know Bitcoin's now it's the as of the time we're recording this podcast, it's down like 50% from its high. But what drove Bitcoin to $120,000 in the first place?
Right.
We
100%.
we it's because we held interest rates artificially low for many, many years. We pumped trillions of dollars into the economy because the U.S. government was running huge deficits, because we were trying to stabilize the economy after the 2008 crisis and during COVID, and that money's going to try to find a rate of return somewhere, and so that's a huge part of the reason why uh, the financial sector of the economy has done really well over the last 40 years, but the industrial part of the economy hasn't done as well. And that's a big reason why we're not seeing the sort of broad-based growth in wages and wealth among the middle class that we saw back in the 1950s and 60s. To draw back on an earlier part of our conversation,
Yeah.
I think monetary policy plays a huge role in that, monetary and tax policy.
So I feel like some of these topics are the ones that get limited by depending on which platform you're on. But when it comes to inflation and the Federal Reserve, my vision of it is it's not really helping the average American because they don't have assets.
Yeah,
So the ultimate financial system is built off the back of Americans that they're not seeing a benefit from. And then when your assets able to grow, you're going to be doing fractionalized spending, you're going to be taking loans. That there's just these systems that are ultimately linked together that are not based off of any actual I don't want to say a product, but my favorite thing to say is fugazi. Like it's not real. So
yeah,
there's if we're looking at free market capitalism for the right, this is my argument, is you should never be too big to fail. Nothing should be that connected. You should have enough competition. If your policy or how you run your company is not good and it's too risky, then it fails. A better program comes up. So like I would love to jump on that side of like absolutely conservative, like be good with your money, don't ruin the economy, like be your own person. If you fail, you failed. We want a better company. So like,
I think this is
yeah.
a really important point. I think, if we're trying to boil all this down to, what is plaguing our economy, especially over the last, 15, 17 years since
Yeah.
the global financial crisis in 2008, is that we've privatized profits and socialized losses. That was kind of the great sin of how we handled the global financial crisis, is that we essentially we nationalized Citibank. We nationalized a lot of these um, banks and institutions. We bailed them out using public funds, and then we allowed them to go right back to doing what they were doing before. And so ultimately, no one adequately learn the lessons from that. And my fear, especially with the Trump administration, is that a lot of people in big tech and these other industries, they recognize that that's the key. They,
Right.
that's the lesson that they probably correctly drew from the global financial crisis is that your ability to make reckless decisions and get bailed out afterwards is dependent on your relationship with the federal government and in this case with Trump personally.
Right.
And so that's my that
I think though
to
Trump's doing the worst thing for big corporation. Things for the last 50 to 60 years been behind the scenes. Just the money's been flowing in. It's been nice and easy, but now it's just in the open. It's like, oh no, the game is up.
he is very much trying to turn our country into a country like Russia. That's why he's such a big admirer of someone like Vladimir Putin, who is essentially the richest person in the world. Even if he doesn't own certain assets on paper, he has access to a lot of assets that are owned in the name of different corporations or other oligarchs. And he's very much trying to replicate the system that they have, where all of the wealth of the country is extracted for a very small elite, but they are able to remain in power using right-wing populist politics. This is a playbook that has been deployed in Russia, in Hungary, in Brazil, and a lot of different countries around the world. And this is what their ultimate goal is. I will say, as to kind of
Yeah.
bring things back to our current era, we were talking about the lessons of the global financial crisis. My concern right now, and kind of looking ahead into the next 2 or 3 years, especially, is that a lot of these big tech companies have invested. I mean, the capital investments in things like data centers is enormous. That the investment in what they call compute I mean, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. And if you were to scale up something like the Manhattan Project, one of our greatest national undertakings in our history, if you scaled it up for inflation, it would be something like, I think it was $2 billion in the 1940s. So I think it would end up at, somewhere between 30 and $40 billion today.
Yeah.
Certain big tech companies like Oracle alone has built or leased $260 billion worth of data centers just in the last 3 or 4 years. So, and that's just one company. So we're talking hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars invested in data centers, and all this new infrastructure. There's no clear pathway for these companies to get a good return on that capital investment. And ultimately, my concern is that they're going to want to tap public funds as a way of getting bailed out, where there's already talk on the left. Bernie Sanders is already talking about saying, "Oh well, we need the federal government to take a stake in these big tech companies because they're essential to national security." My concern is that that is going to end up being very bipartisan talk of socializing the losses once these big tech companies realize that they're not going to be able to get such a good return on their investment. They're going to say, "Oh well, this is essential for
Well, I
national
think they
security.
already
We need
know.
the federal government to be involved."
I think they already know. By the time they, so I won't say I was huge into Bitcoin, but I got in.
Yeah.
And I started mining at a time where it was reasonable to get in. The chips change every 2 to 3 years. By the time they install and have ordered and whatever, the amount of just hardware, not even the software, is not available for, I want to say mining, but for these data centers. And then when they actually finally plug them in, they're going to be so far behind on compute that they're going to be like, well, we need to switch all of this out for the new software, the new chips. And that's one of the big reasons that I got a couple things here. They don't have to use so much water. They can immerse it in oil. That's way, but it's more expensive to start off with. But ultimately, I don't think they're really going to be doing this as a uh, putting together a solid business model. I think they're trying to get the loans because they have to have them running by early 2027 or what to get whatever that is. And a lot of the people are paying tens of millions of dollars just to get on a list to get the equipment. So I feel like there's a shell game being put on, similar to like the
Yeah, and
solar for some stuff.
you also mentioned tax policy. I think this is another point about data centers in particular to understand is I believe there's these companies are allowed bonus depreciation up until 2030 on data centers
Yes.
specifically, right? So for anyone who's not as familiar with tax policy, normally when you make a big capital investment, you invest $100 million in a data center, you have to capitalize that cost. You can't write off $100 million off your taxes in the first year. You have to amortize that capital cost over a certain period of time. So,
Yep.
for a residential house, it's 27 and a half years. For a car, it's 5 years. I don't know what it is for a data center, but uh, as it is, current tax policy allows for bonus depreciation, meaning that you can take that entire capital investment and write it off on your taxes in 1 year. You don't have to capitalize it. It just ends up as a one-time write-off, which is great if you're trying to make money right now and you're trying
Right.
to get your quarterly earnings out and there's a big stock market bubble. That's wonderful. So I think you're right. There also is a race against the clock to get a lot of these data centers up and running before that bonus depreciation goes away.
So the thing as far as like Trump and the power and the consolidation,
Yeah.
if we were to take Trump out of the situation, we'll bring it back in a moment. But if we were to look at the political system as a whole, anyways, do you feel that with both parties, they've been feeding more or less the same monster and allowing the same things to happen? Now, if you look at the Democrats, you're going to have a better economy, which is hilarious in the way of like they're spending a bunch of money on programs trying to keep like the American people happy, so on and so forth. If the Republicans just didn't go to war, they would be saving trillions of dollars and could call themselves fiscally responsible. But ultimately, somehow the money from the middle class America has just been slowly moving up. And I think it's somewhere around 25 to 35% of the wealth from the average worker has moved upwards. And that's happened under both parties' watches. Um, and like you said, I feel like the left America is still very middle. So it's still run by a lot of corporations, but um, I don't. You play in the system that you have. What are your
I used to be a lot more willing to kind of entertain that idea that,
okay?
oh well, both sides are complicit in this. And on to some extent, I think there is merit in and this has been a big part of my campaign from the start. I'm running in a Democratic primary, in a very crowded Democratic primary with 22 candidates,
Yeah,
but it started out with just me primary challenging my 86, almost 87-year-old congressman, Steny Hoyer, who's been in office for 45 years now.
that's wild.
And it's yeah, he's been the representative for this district since before either of us were born. It's before most of the people in this district were born. It's totally nuts. And that's been my point from day one of this campaign is that Donald Trump is very much, again, I'm running in a closed Democratic primary. I'm only going after Democratic voters here. And my point to Democratic voters in particular is, look, Donald Trump is a symptom, but the disease in our political system
Yes,
is a Congress that couldn't make basic policy decisions on really salient issues, couldn't make decisions on things like immigration, couldn't update our tax policies, outsourced debates on a lot of really important social issues like abortion or gay marriage to the judiciary. Congress was only too happy to give away more and more of its powers to the other branches of government. And so, is it any surprise that we end up with a judiciary that's way more politicized than it used to be, and an executive that's completely out of control? And look, this was you asked about changing parties and my political development back in 2009 2010. I was still I don't want to say I was very right wing, but I remember very clearly criticizing the Obama administration at the time over things like drone strikes or abuses of FISA court warrants, things like that. And my point to Democrats at the time in particular was, look, you're not always going to have a Harvard educated constitutional law scholar as president. At some point, you're going to get a real asshole, like a real moron who just abuses their power for political ends. And here we are, not even 15 years later, and that's exactly what we have. You have someone who doesn't have any sort of respect for the Constitution or the rule of law, and simply sees the federal government as a means of enriching himself and his family. Uh, so on the one hand, yeah, I think there's some merit to the idea that both sides are complicit in this. I think a lot of that comes down to the weakness of Congress as a branch
Okay.
of government. And then if
Yeah.
we can fix Congress and implement certain structural reforms to Congress, that will solve a lot of these other problems. But I don't think we should have any illusions, and I'm very, very clear on this. I don't think we should have any illusions about what the Republican Party is right now or what the MAGA movement represents. This is not just a normal political cycle where we're going back and forth about tax policy and saying, oh, well, the Democrats want higher marginal rates and the Republicans have a slightly different
Yeah.
philosophy on this. No, we are way past that. The Republican Party is dominated by MAGA, which is a white supremacist fascist movement that has no respect for our 250-year history of liberal democratic development. They are fundamentally different from any previous iteration of the Republican Party. It's actually quite different from anything that we've really seen as a political force in U.S. politics. Maybe you could go back to the Jim Crow era politics or kind of early iterations of the KKK that were not really as politically active, especially they weren't as dominant on the federal level. I don't think we really have any sort of precedent for this in American politics. Uh, MAGA it is represents a really fundamental split from the Republican Party that I grew up with. Even from the Grover Norquist, Newt Gingrich sort of Republican Party that would often talk about uh, taxes in populist terms. They fundamentally do not see any sort of democratic electoral victory as legitimate. They see a certain portion of the United States population as their enemy. And so this is a very different conception of American politics. This is not something that we've dealt with before. And I think that's a real weakness of the Democratic Party right now is that we're still trying to treat the Republican Party like the Republican Party of the 1980s or 1990s, in large part because our party is still run by literally the same people who were active in politics back in the
That were
19,
there.
right? You literally still have Steny Hoyer in Congress. You still have Chuck Schumer as he's not just in Congress. He
Yeah.
entered Congress the same year as Steny Hoyer in 1981. He moved over to the Senate and he's our he's supposed to be our leader in the Senate. He's still looking for a Republican Party where we all kind of agree on the basic fundamental principles of democracy, and we're just arguing about policy, and we're going to come to some, we all have a shared reality, and we're going to come to some sort of compromise. And that's just not how the Republican Party functions anymore. And so I don't think we should have any illusions about that. And so I'm a lot less willing to say nowadays, oh well, both sides are kind of the same. Everyone's kind of in on it. I think that's a key part of the current administration's plan is to what all I heard on Fox News because remember, it was blaring at the firehouse 24/7 for the last 15 years. So I heard every little
Yeah.
bit of I've heard everything that was ever said on Fox News. Um, I don't even think the guys at the firehouse knew I was running for office until I appeared on Fox News.
Yeah.
I didn't tell them, but I knew as soon as I had an interview with Bill Hammer, I knew everyone would know because I knew it would be playing in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Anyway, um, you know, I again, I remember when Fox News wasn't completely uh, state media here. But now it certainly is.
Yeah.
I don't think we should have any illusions about what the MAGA project is or where they want to take us. So I'm a lot less willing to indulge that argument.
Um,
Hey, there she is. Hey, sweetie.
um, so
I can hear my kid crying upstairs.
Um, so would not necessarily my argument because then it goes back and forth. My I guess end goal would be more or less there's a cultish vibe, but generally if you are in a cult, that means you're just following something because you were looking for something. So inherently, I'm not um the friends of mine that may be considered MAGA or whatever it may be, when I talk to them, it's just they didn't ultimately change since Trump came up, but their vision is they're looking for something different. Absolutely got bamboozled, whatever it is. But they're still the same people that I like. They're not going to do anything horrific per se. And I feel that the loudest voices and the most aggressive voices are the ones that are being heard. And a majority of the people that I know that may be considered MAGA are not fascists. They're not looking for this power. They're just there can't even be this discussion anymore where every single time that I talk to them in a way of, hey, like what's our goal here? Like what are your struggles? This is why things in my mind went well. This is what I see as far as just the middle class economy doesn't have money anymore. I don't want to limit anybody's top end wealth or whatever it is, but if they are killing somebody, if they're harming someone, if they're stealing, if whatever it is, and then I get into monopolies, I was like, hey, like I'm all for big business, but we want competitiveness. There just seems to be a lack of um I guess education as well because we just don't have time anymore. I'm a stay-at-home dad. Like it's I listen to podcasts all the time. I watch YouTube videos. Most people they wake up in the morning, they go to work, they come home, they watch Netflix, they're tired, or they, God forbid, they actually get to spend time with their kids. And there's nothing past the surface level question that they ever have to answer. And right now it's all just a lot of infighting. And I don't think it has anything to do with politics. It's just an opinion that they haven't had to question.
Yeah, and look, I don't. Do I think that every guy at my firehouse who voted for Trump is a doctrinaire fascist or
Hmm.
or understands all the philosophy
Yeah,
behind it? No, of course not. Most people are just trying to get through the day. Most people are, like you say, they're trying to pay their bills and maybe spend a little time with their kids.
right.
And their experience of politics is probably a lot different than mine. I certainly recognize that. And yeah, a lot of these people did get bamboozled. And some of them recognize that, but some people are also very, very deep in the cult now. Um,
Absolutely.
I, I I think it's important to recognize here. There's a really great book go- going back to being a nerd for a second. Really awesome book called The Name of the Rose.
Okay.
It's basically like a murder. I don't read a lot of fiction, but this is basically it's like a murder mystery that takes place in an abbey in medieval Italy. Really, really cool, really, really cool book. It was written by a guy named Umberto Eco, who grew up in fascist Italy. He was a kid, and he was born in like 1930 or 31. So he was a little kid growing up in fascist Italy, and he was still pretty young during the war. And he wrote an essay towards the end of his life in the 1990s where he identified 14 key characteristics of fascism
Okay.
that, he said, okay, well, what is fascism? People use this word, but it's a little bit hard to define. And he identified these specific principles. And it's really chill. He's writing this in the 1990s. It's really chilling to read this essay now, which is called Fascism. So you are dash fascism,
I
or
definitely
meaning,
would have went ER.
yeah, yeah. So I I don't know if it's a Latin or Greek group, but basically it means like essential or base
Okay.
fascism. And it's really chilling to go down the list and see how closely it mirrors what you see with today's MAGA movement. Do I think that, again, do I think every guy in my firehouse who votes for MAGA, or considers themselves MAGA, do they understand all those principles? No, of course not. To a large extent, I think you're right. I think people just wanted something different, and now we have this kind of weird inversion in our party system where the ostensibly left party, the Democratic Party, in many ways is the more conservative party. We're the ones that are trying to preserve institutions. We're the one, a lot of my fellow Democrats, I don't totally agree with them on this. A lot of them are just trying to put things back the way they were before 2015, and I
Right.
don't think that's really what our political project is. But I just want to point out to you and your listeners
Yeah.
a few key things about MAGA that really makes it different than previous political movements in the United States or previous iterations of the Republican Party. Trump is very authoritarian. He does not have respect for the Constitution or the rule of law, and we've seen that in the way he's abused the judicial system, the way he uses the Department of Justice now to go after his political enemies, to levy outwardly political prosecutions. This is very different than what we've had in the past. So, authoritarianism is a really essential component of this.
I feel
The
like that
se
you. Sorry, I'm going to
No,
try to
no, no.
remember.
Well, I'll give you the three, and
Yeah.
feel free to push back.
Yeah.
The second, and I think this is probably the most important one, is that, again, he he and other people in his administration, they do not see the Democratic Party as a legitimate political opposition.
Okay.
They are always talking about Democrats as the enemy within. They talk about, they talk about any sort of political opposition as this insidious force. And I think this is a really essential component of fascism, is that they claim to represent the true American people. They are not a movement that represents all Americans or claims to represent all Americans or speak for all Americans. There's no concept of every individual as a citizen having rights under a common system. They see certain Americans as having rights and liberties and others as not being deserving of those rights. And of course, if you claim to represent the true people, anyone who opposes you politically is by definition against the people. And again, this is something you see in every fascist movement. And the last thing is, this is something that Democrats, especially Democrats in politics, have a really hard time getting their head around, is that MAGA it's an irrational force. It's all about action for the sake of action.
Okay.
It's all about force and will over logic and reason. And I think it's very hard for people who are more rational thinkers, or who are approaching public policy from a rational standpoint. It's very hard to understand what the administration is trying to accomplish if you're thinking about it in rational terms. Remember, that was the big, there was a big film made about the Nazis' Nuremberg rally in 1935, which was called "The Triumph of the Will." That
Hmm.
was the that was that was a really key component of of their movement, and similarly of the MAGA movement, is that it's all about action, and half the people in the administration are reality TV stars, including Trump himself. It's all about this sort of this this performance. Look at how Pete Hegseth approaches the Iran war. All this talk about war fighters and fire and fury, and in many cases these video compilations that are sometimes AI generated. That he's playing who he thinks the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of War, whatever he wants to, he's playing a character in a movie. And of course, why not? He's a TV host.
Yeah.
That's his expertise. And so those are the three principles that I see as a common thread between MAGA and previous fascist movements. But definitely read that essay, and
Yeah.
you'll see exactly the similarities between what he's talking about and what has popped up in the US in the last few years.
So I feel like my old school style would have been like, hey, these are the three things you said, and then I'm gonna be like, oh, the U.S. government did this, 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 and this. But I'm gonna work on my new technique by my course soon. Um, so I think the issue that I'm having is um he is not a single decision maker. I don't believe that his thoughts are more or less his own by the people that have his ear. And the people that have his ear are either going to be financially incentivizing him or financially controlling or controlling in a different way that I don't need to speculate on because I don't have 3 million pages of proof.
Well,
But if
I think that's totally fair, and I think a lot of this sticks around after Trump. Trump's going to be out of the picture pretty soon, one way
yeah.
or the other, either the cholesterol or his war crimes trial, or what something will happen, and he'll go back to Mar-a-Lago, or he'll go to prison, or he'll flee to Russia. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but he's going to be gone at some point, but the stain will remain. I agree with you that it's not just him and his thoughts. A lot of this is, and this is why I typically refer to the MAGA movement, because
Yeah.
it is just beyond him. I could definitely see a lot of these same sorts of the same sort of right-wing populist politics remaining under a JD Vance even after Trump's out of the picture.
And do you think the division or lack of both parties' ability to get things done, is a positive for the American people or more of a positive for the large controlling corporations? And that was that was a leading question. If you want to change
Yeah.
the question, if you want, like I that was I because that's
No,
the way
it's
I,
no,
yeah,
that's okay. Because maybe 15 years ago, I would have, my libertarian answer would have been, yeah, it's great that Congress is so deadlocked. That way they can't screw anything else up. But I also now I recognize that their inability to um, push meaningful legislation forward, that's a direct contributor to this sort of right-wing populist politics. That was a huge factor in allowing someone like Donald Trump to come to the forefront, someone who said, well, I'm not going to abide by the rule of law or the democratic process. I don't need all of these stupid hearings
yeah.
in Congress with Steny Hoyer and Chuck Schumer, and listening to these old guys. I'm going to cut through the bureaucracy like a sword, with a sword, and just get things done. And I'm going to rule by decree on Twitter. And a lot of people said, hey, you know what? Maybe that's a better system of government than what we've tried. And to go back to your point, yeah, a lot of voters simply voted for something, they wanted something different. And I don't think that I don't think that, having a dictator ruling by decree on social media on Truth Social. I don't think that's an improvement on our democratic system, but it's hard to look at the last 40 years of how Congress has functioned and say, yeah, this is a great model to emulate, and this is a path forward because demonstrably they haven't been able to provide a good quality of life and a path forward in our society for a huge part of the population. And you know, speaking for the Democratic Party, we need to reckon with that. We need to recognize that the way we've been uh, operating for the last 40 years, there is no future there.
Yeah.
We need to put forward a platform where people really say, okay, well, I'm going to vote for Democrats. Here's what I'm going to get. I think you could have gone to any polling booth in the country in November of 2024, and the median voter could have told you, hey, yeah, Donald Trump, here's what he's going to do when he gets in office. He's going to build the wall. He's going to go after his political enemies. He's
Not going to go to war.
well, people thought that is what he said. But I don't think people could really tell you anything about what Kamala Harris
Right.
was planning on doing. She infamously she had an opportunity, I think in one of the debates, to distance herself from the Biden administration, and she couldn't do it. And
They
you
just
know,
kept playing that clip over. They said, "What would you do differently than Biden
yeah,
would do?"
right.
Like,
Brutal.
come on.
People were begging for
Yeah.
something, and again, we're now in this weird situation where the Democratic Party is in many ways the more conservative of the two parties. Um, uh, and the Republicans are the ones trying to do, I don't think trying to implement something better, but they're certainly trying to tear down institutions and do something different, which is, historically that would be a function of the more left-leaning party in other political systems.
Mhm. My goal is to be able to combat that with, as I said before, I try to tell my wife this, but she laughed at me, like the best ideas, because I feel the best ideas should be able to be put through the ringer to find the success to combat whatever a lawyer or somebody might say in a combat section comment section and be able to delineate why it's a positive thing. So if you were to pick like one thing that not necessarily that you're going to run on, but you could see that's a really strong point, either for your party or something you'd like to see done, what would that one thing be?
A big part of my campaign has been talking about housing and transit. We need to be a country that builds things
Absolutely.
again. It used to be, 40, 50 years ago, people from European countries would visit the United States and they would be envious of our big houses and our big cars and our highway system. And we were the country with all the new infrastructure. And you know they wanted the American dream. That's what the American dream was that
Yeah.
this great standard of living of in terms of material wealth. And now in many ways it's the other way around, where Americans go and visit Europe and they're the ones who have new trains and new infrastructure and universal health care, and we're all of a sudden we're the ones who want that sort of lifestyle.
Oh, I'm
And
clipping that. That's phenomenal.
it's kind of a right. It's kind of a funny role
Yeah.
reversal. And I think this is something that every English speaking country has run into, that this is just a function of having a common law legal system where it's relatively easy to sue and derail long-term planning projects. But so you see housing costs rising at a much faster rate in, it's not just the US, but also Canada and Ireland and the UK and Australia. You see housing costs rising in those countries over the last 40 years at a much faster rate than they rose in France or Spain or Italy. And you see a lot of those civil law countries in Western Europe, they're able to build a lot more new things like new rail infrastructure. They're able to accomplish those projects much more easily because they're able to to come up with a long-term plan for a certain area and stick to it over a 30 or 40
God.
year uh, time period. I remember I worked in Shanghai for about a year, and I remember there was a new. I didn't allow myself many Western luxuries while I was over there, but there was a supermarket called Carrefour. I guess it's a French hypermart. I think they used to have them in the U.S. for a time, but it's like a big, supermarket and
Yeah.
department store sort of thing. Anyway, I wanted those, those like chocolate biscuits with
Yeah.
the, it's like a cracker when like there's a
A
dark
wafer.
chocolate on
Yeah.
top. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So like, um, that was my one Western item that I allowed myself when I was over there. So I remember that they opened, I think it was line 10 in Shanghai opened when I was there. So, I hopped on and I took it out to where the Carrefour was, and I got out, and there's a Carrefour on one corner, and the other, like two, like the other side of the street was basically where there were just like brownfield sites. There was
Okay.
like nothing there. And I remember thinking to myself, like, oh, this is a classic communist misallocation of capital. They built this subway out here and there's nobody to ride it because, they built it out in the middle, it's like your classic story of socialist poor planning,
Right.
and, that's what I thought, thinking to myself, I'm like, I'm an American, I know better. I went back there a couple years later. I was just on vacation, and I was showing my mom around.
Yeah.
I took her, I was just showing her like where I lived when I was in Shanghai, and we got off at the same spot, went to the same Carrefour, but this time I get out of the subway, and there are like 80 new high rises on the other side of the street, 80 new residential high rises, and that was definitely eye-opening. That they had a much more well thought out long-term plan for how to build their transit and also how to build residential real estate around these
Right.
new transit stops. And that's something I think it's really stupid. The way we build transit in North America is we put a train station out in the middle of nowhere, surround it with parking lots, and then wonder why no one rides the train. It's because the transit stops are not near where anyone lives, and they don't go to where people need to go. It's really, really simple. And so my policy prescription for this is essentially there was a recent bill passed in California. Um, Shout out to my fellow gay Jewish politician Scott Wiener, who's also running for Congress, um, uh, who's also a big NIMBY, or sorry, a big YIMBY. Um, yeah, he wants more housing and wants to encourage housing policy. Um, I would like to see a federal version of the bill that he got passed in California, which would essentially say, okay, well, by right, any sort of development within a quarter mile or a half mile of transit stations would uh, definitionally you would be allowed to build walkable mixed use communities around these transit stations.
Okay.
And so I think that's a really good uh, that's a really good federal way to override a lot of local NIMBYism. And also, we should just rethink our financing model for a lot of these transit projects. We think of we love to have socialism in the United States for big highway projects and then rugged capitalism for transit projects. But we should adopt the development models of a lot of transit agencies, and for instance, in Hong Kong or Japan, the transit agency itself is allowed to benefit from the increase in land value around new transit stops. So you say, okay, well, we build the transit station, the transit agency itself will essentially have an equity stake in the land around these new transit stops instead of just turning over all of the profit potential to private developers. And at that point, that can fund a lot of the upfront construction cost. Essentially, you're borrowing against the future increase in land value around these transit stations, and that the transit agency
Yeah.
itself will have an equity stake in some sort of um, uh, real estate development around the new transit infrastructure. It's also a way to solve the tension between, look, I own a house here in Maryland's fifth district. Most of the voters in my election are homeowners. We don't want to see the value of our houses go down. On the other hand, I have a lot of friends who are our age who still don't own a house. The median age of a first-time home buyer in this country is 40. The median age of a home buyer overall is 59. That is not sustained, right? And that's just when we were born, that was like the median age of a first-time home buyer was like 27 or 28. That's a huge change in our society. That's something we have to address. So this sort of federal policy is a way to incentivize construction of um, construction of affordable housing without really impacting existing suburban
Yeah.
communities. You're only affecting 0.1 or 0.2% of the land area in any state. It's, even here in Maryland, where we actually do have a lot of transit
Yeah.
infrastructure.
Now that's a plan right there. That could be a live stream for 10 days just asking you policy questions, figuring them out right there. I could sit on and watch for the next 10 hours. But because we both have children, we're gonna move on. And I'll finish up with the last two questions.
Yeah.
This one's a little bit more personal. As far as health goes, what's your definition of health? Not necessarily the dictionary definition, but what is health to you?
That's a great question. You asked if I, played any sports when I was a kid. I was really unathletic. I mean, I could barely run like, 400 meters in gym class. And it really wasn't until after I remember it was my last year in college. I finished kind of early, so I guess it was my like the end of my third year, and I had a finance exam, and I got there, and it's maybe like 5, 10 minutes before the exam's supposed to start, and I realized I forgot my calculator. So I had to like dead sprint back to my dorm room to grab a calculator, and it was me I don't know, it was maybe 200 or 300 yards each way. It wasn't super far, but I remember like running back to the exam, and I was maybe halfway there, and I realized I just could not
Oh
dead
no!
sprint. I had to stop and walk because I was completely gassed. And I remember thinking to myself like, wow, I'm not like a kid anymore. I can't just like sprint as hard as I can without really thinking about it. And that was kind of a wake up call
Mhm.
for me. And after that, I really tried to get in shape, and that was also kind of an incentive for me joining the my local volunteer fire department. I was like,
Yeah.
all right, hey, I've been trying to like get in good shape. Like, I want to see what I can do. Like, can I do this? So I don't know if I have a good definition of health beyond just, feeling like I can do whatever I want to do without a ton of physical effort. And I don't need to be a bodybuilder or anything. And I'll tell you, a lot of the guys at not just my firehouse, but firehouses all over the country are not in the best shape. But I also understand that I can be a better public asset. I can be a better asset to my community if I am in good shape.
Mhm.
Um, it's also firefighting in particular. It's not it's not just it's a different kind of physicality. I remember we did this training session one time. There were a bunch of these Marines who were training. It was just it's like be a firefighter for a day. I don't know how they ended up there, but these guys were absolutely ripped. These guys were like Greek statues, and but we put air packs on them, and an air pack is like it's like you're breathing through a straw,
Yeah.
and the key is really to conserve your air so you have more time to do what you need to do in a structure fire. Otherwise you're gonna in theory you might have a 30 or a 45-minute bottle, but that's 30 or 45 minutes if you're just sitting here like doing a podcast. It's
Right.
not it's not going to last 30 minutes if you're actually fighting a fire. You're lucky if you get
Okay.
8 or 10 minutes
Yeah.
uh, actually in a fire before your low air alarm goes off at 1/3 air remaining. I remember, we put these big Marine dudes in the air packs and had them do basic dragon hose around or whatever, and they were absolutely gassed.
Ooh,
They were like sucking wind. We took the air pack off, and they're like totally like hyperventilating. It was kind of fascinating. And meanwhile, sometimes you'll have guys who look really out of shape, but in a fire, they're amazing.
yeah.
They're they it's like a technique thing. So I would say that's my definition of health. It's really just being able to do what I want or need to do um, without really thinking about it too hard.
Absolutely. And then the last one is what's something from your life people listening to the podcast would be able to take away as a positive?
Sorry, can you ask that one more
Yeah.
time?
So, what's something from your life that people listening to the podcast would be able to take away as a positive? Either a story you remember or
Yeah,
something just like a,
I when I was a teenager, or even when I was in college, I really you know, I, I didn't think I would be able to get married and have a family and have a, normal life. Things have really progressed in our society, even just in the last 15 or 20 years. We were making really, really good progress. And now I have a husband and two kids, and that's really what I always wanted. And I'm glad that for the current generation of younger people, that's a that's a possibility that's much more attainable than maybe it was for me. And
yeah.
and I'm only 36. I'm not even that old. So that's something that's changed in our society very, very quickly. And we've made such tremendous progress in the last 50 or 60 years on a lot of social and civil rights fronts like that. But on, that's maybe a feel good story for about me personally,
Yeah.
but I also fear that we're starting to go in the other direction. And my main takeaway for a lot of your viewers is that we shouldn't assume that social progress is inevitable.
Oh,
We're not the first society to go through a convulsion like this, and it would be wrong to assume that that sort of progress is automatic or inevitable. We're still going to have to fight for it. I
mhm.
think that was maybe a we gained a little bit too much false confidence from the 2014 Supreme Court case that legalized gay marriage, or a lot of other court cases. I think this goes back to Congress not really functioning as a legislative body.
Yeah.
Um, that we didn't make these gains through legislative or political accomplishments. We gained them through the court system. Um, and I think that maybe gave us, I don't want to say it was easy, but we didn't do the political work to get enough people on our side to make those changes through legislation. We
Mhm.
we we did that through another avenue. Um, and I think that gave us a bit of false confidence.
Okay.
And so I think we should be very careful going forward, understanding that it's very easy to regress and go back in the other direction, and we shouldn't
Right.
have any illusions about it. And that's going to be a big challenge for the next couple of years.
Well, there we go. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.